The galaxy was on fire. Stars, once beacons of hope, now burned like dying embers in a darkened sky. The once thriving human colonies scattered across the universe had been reduced to ashes, victims of an unstoppable force, the Seraphis. For centuries, these warlords had torn through the cosmos with relentless precision, eradicating civilizations in their wake. They were ruthless, a race of advanced beings who ruled through fear and annihilation, their technology far beyond anything humanity had ever dreamed. But not all was lost. In the cold depths of space, far from the battlegrounds and the scorched worlds, humanity's last hope remained, a fleet of survivors. Commander Darius Voss, a battle-hardened leader, stood as the final line of defense between the Seraphis and the extinction of the human race. His hands were stained with the blood of his people, his heart burdened by the weight of responsibility. The mission ahead was a desperate one, to retrieve an ancient weapon that could turn the tide of the war. But even in the darkest corners of space, hope is a fragile thing. As Darius prepared to lead his team into the unknown, he had no idea that the weapon they sought was more than just a tool of war. It was a force that would forever alter the course of his destiny. The fleet drifted in silence, a ragtag assembly of ships barely holding together after years of relentless conflict. Their shields flickered with intermittent power, and engines hummed with the barest of energy. Commander Darius Voss stood at the Bridge of the Elysium, the flagship of the human resistance fleet. The large viewing window in front of him framed a galaxy in chaos, a star system on the edge of collapse. The once pristine planets that orbited this system were now fractured, their surfaces cracked and broken by the might of the Seraphis warlords. Darius's eyes were bloodshot, his mind weary from days of planning and preparation. His hands gripped the railing as he gazed out at the stars, the weight of humanity's last hope pressing down on his shoulders. He had seen entire colonies fall, friends and allies lost to the void. His crew was all that remained of humanity's once proud fleet, and now they were about to embark on a mission that could either save or doom them all. "Commander, the Seraphis fleet is still tracking us," came the voice of Lieutenant Mira Kalin, his trusted second-in-command. Her voice was calm, steady, almost too steady given the gravity of the situation. Darius turned, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "How long until they arrive?" he asked. 4 hours, maybe less," she replied, tapping at the holo-display in front of her. The image of a Seraphis battlecruiser loomed on the screen, a behemoth of destruction, its silhouette black against the dim backdrop of distant stars. "We're running out of time." Darius exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the power of the Seraphis firsthand. The memory of the battle at Elysium's last stand was still fresh. Hundreds of ships destroyed, thousands of lives lost in the blink of an eye. Their enemies were brutal, efficient, and relentless, but humanity had something the Seraphis did not: determination. "We won't let them win," Darius muttered to himself, more for his own reassurance than anything else. He turned to the crew. "Prepare for launch. We make the jump in 30 minutes. I want everyone ready." The crew members snapped to attention, moving quickly to carry out their orders. Darius's eyes lingered on the hollow map of the galaxy. The mission was simple: find the ancient weapon. It was a relic from a time long forgotten, a weapon said, to possess the power to obliterate entire fleets in a single stroke. It was their only chance to defeat the Seraphis, if they could retrieve it in time. But nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Mira approached him, her expression tense. "Commander, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." She hesitated. "What if we can't get the weapon? What if we fail?" Darius gave a small, bitter smile. "Then we die, all of us. It's that simple." He knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and barely able to hold their ground. The Seraphis had crushed the best fleets humanity had ever assembled. But the weapon, this ancient power that had been locked away for centuries, was their last chance. They had no other choice but to believe in its existence, in its power, and in their ability to find it before the Seraphis did. "Commander, we're ready for jump," Mira said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Good. Set course for the coordinates and tell the others to prepare themselves. This is it." The crew was silent as the countdown began. Darius stood motionless, his mind still on the path ahead. As the seconds ticked down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weapon they sought was legendary, spoken of only in hushed whispers by those who had survived the Seraphis onslaught. Some said it was a ship, others a weapon of mass destruction, a doomsday device. But there was always one consistent detail. It required the blood of a human warrior to activate it. What Darius didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the weapon they sought was no ordinary device. It was something far older, far more dangerous than they could ever imagine, and the price of unlocking its power would be far greater than any of them could comprehend. Jumping in 3, 2, 1. The stars stretched out in long, ethereal lines as the ship engaged its FTL drive, sending them hurtling across the galaxy. For a moment, all was still. But Darius knew that the calm before the storm was only temporary. The Seraphis would follow, relentless and unforgiving. The real battle had only just begun. The stars bled into streaks of white light as the Elysium sped through the void, its engines humming in a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. On the bridge, a tense silence hung over the crew as they braced themselves for the jump to their destination. The galaxy outside seemed endless, a dark ocean stretching far beyond the edges of their vision. There was no telling what awaited them in the distant system, but Darius's mind was sharp, his focus absolute. "Approaching the system, Commander," Lieutenant Kalen said, her voice steady despite the growing anxiety in her eyes. She turned to him, eyes reflecting the same burden that weighed on his heart. Darius nodded, but didn't respond. He was already on edge, feeling the pressure building in his chest as the cold void of space surrounded them. This mission was humanity's final hope, and the weapon they sought could be their salvation or their doom. "Any sign of the Seraphis?" he asked, his voice low. Kalen shook her head. "Not yet. But they're out there. We won't be able to stay hidden for long." Darius clenched his fists, feeling the familiar ache in his bones. The Seraphis were always close, always hunting them down. Every jump they made, every moment they spent in the darkness was a risk. And yet, they had no choice. The weapon was their only chance to survive. "We'll need to be quick," Darius said, his mind already racing through the plan. "Once we reach the coordinates, we'll split into teams. Mira, you take Lieutenant Gannon and Dr. Klein. Secure the perimeter and find the weapon. I'll stay with the ship, ready to provide backup." Mira nodded sharply. "Understood. Move, or fast," Darius added, his gaze lingering on the map projected before him. The destination was a barren planet, isolated from the rest of the galaxy. The ancient weapon was rumored to be buried beneath its surface, hidden for centuries. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the Seraphis, but that was a thought for later. ETA. 15 minutes, Kalen reported. "I'll prepare the team for landing." Darius turned to her. "Keep comms open. If we encounter resistance, I want to know immediately." "Of course, Commander." With the plan set, Darius walked to the observation window, his eyes tracing the stars. He had led countless missions, but none felt quite like this. This wasn't just a strike against the Seraphis. This was humanity's final chance. The weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt, no room for fear. "We're approaching the planet," Kalen's voice broke through his thoughts. Initiating orbital entry. Darius stepped back from the window and moved toward the command chair. The crew sprang into action as the ship entered the planet's atmosphere. The descent was smooth, but Darius could feel the tension mounting. As they neared the surface, the ancient weapon was close, and yet something gnawed at him, an instinctual unease that refused to be ignored. The landing was uneventful, but the quiet was unsettling. The Elysium touched down on the barren, dusty plains of the planet. The surface was a graveyard of forgotten civilizations, ruins of a time long past, their origins lost to history. The planet was uninhabited now, its once vibrant ecosystems destroyed by wars and disasters. Only remnants remained, broken structures, scorched landscapes, and a deep, pervasive silence. Darius stepped out of the ship, the ground beneath his boots soft and dry. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying the smell of dust and ancient stone. His team followed closely behind, each of them moving with the practiced precision of soldiers who had seen too much war, too much death. "Stay sharp," Darius muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone or anything had been here for a long time, but they couldn't afford to be complacent. Mira, leading the way, checked her scanner. "I'm reading something," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "It's faint, like a signal coming from underground." "Underground," Darius repeated. "How deep?" "Hard to tell. But it's coming from that ridge," she said, pointing to a series of jagged rocks and cliffs in the distance. "Then that's where we go," Darius said firmly. "Everyone, move out. Stay in formation." As the team made their way across the desert-like expanse, the tension grew. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional whisper of wind. Darius's mind wandered back to the weapon. He had read all the reports, studied every piece of intel. The weapon had been described as a relic from an ancient war, an object of unimaginable power, capable of altering the course of history. But he knew the true danger was not the weapon itself. It was what it might do to the one who wielded it. And that thought weighed heavily on him. What if this weapon was more than they realized? What if it was something else entirely? The ridge loomed closer, and Darius could feel a strange energy in the air, an unsettling charge that made his skin crawl. He had faced many dangers in his life, ruthless Seraphis warlords, impossible odds, but this felt different. This felt like something ancient and primal, a force that could change everything. They reached the base of the ridge, where a set of narrow caves led deep into the planet's crust. The signal was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was coming from within. "I don't like this," Lieutenant Gannon said, his voice low. He was a seasoned soldier, one of Darius's most trusted men. "This feels wrong." "It's too late for doubt," Darius replied. "We're already in." The team entered the caves, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were smooth, as though carved by an ancient hand, and the deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the dim light from their torches flickered uneasily in the gloom. Minutes passed like hours as they ventured deeper. Every footstep echoed, each sound amplifying the tension in their chests. Darius's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his blade. His senses heightened. Something was watching them, something old and powerful. Finally, they reached a chamber at the heart of the cave, a massive hall, its walls adorned with strange symbols and ancient writings. At the center of the room was a pedestal, upon which lay a glowing crystalline object. The air around it hummed with an unnatural energy, and Darius could feel the power radiating from it. "This is it," Mira said, her voice filled with awe. "This is the weapon." Darius stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he approached the pedestal, a thought flashed through his mind, one he couldn't shake. The weapon wasn't just a tool. It was something more, something far beyond what they had expected. Before he could reach out to touch it, a voice echoed through the chamber, low, distorted, and ancient. "Who dares awaken me?" The voice reverberated through the cavern, its resonance causing the air itself to thrum. Darius froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, while his team tensed, weapons drawn, eyes darting around the chamber. The crystalline object on the pedestal pulsed with an eerie light, casting unnatural shadows on the ancient walls. "Who dares awaken me?" The voice was not human. It was distorted, a mixture of deep bass tones and mechanical whirs, as though it were a machine attempting to speak through a human mouth. The words seemed to echo from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It was everywhere and nowhere. Darius's mind raced. The weapon was alive, alive in a way he hadn't anticipated. They had come here seeking power, a tool to defeat the Seraphis. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't a weapon, it was a consciousness. And in that moment, Darius realized they were no longer in control. "Stay calm," Darius ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching softly on the stone floor. "We've come for the weapon. We mean you no harm." The light from the pedestal grew brighter, as if the crystal itself was responding to Darius's words. And then the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "Weapon?" it asked, its tone laced with contempt. "You call me a weapon. I'm more than that. I'm the last soldier, the one who fought, the one who bled, the one who was forged into this form." Darius's heart skipped a beat. "Last soldier?" His voice barely escaped as a whisper, but the question hung in the air, thick with meaning. The crystal flashed again, its light now almost blinding. A pulse of energy surged outward, radiating through the chamber. The walls seemed to tremble, and Darius could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "You seek me to end a war," the voice continued, a strange mix of sorrow and anger in its tone. "You seek the power to destroy your enemies, but you do not understand the cost. The power you crave was not meant for you." The air in the room grew colder, the atmosphere more oppressive, as if the very cave itself were alive, breathing in sync with the weapon. Darius felt a shiver crawl up his spine. His fingers twitched around the grip of his sidearm, but he kept his composure. His crew stood still behind him, waiting for his next command, but even they seemed to sense the danger in the room. "What do you mean?" Darius asked, his voice laced with both caution and curiosity. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on the glowing crystal. "You're telling us that you're not a weapon. What are you then?" For a long moment, the only sound in the cavern was the distant hum of energy emanating from the pedestal. Then the voice returned, softer now, almost mournful. "I am not a thing to be wielded, Commander," the voice replied, a faint tremor in its tone. "I am a soul, a mind twisted and bound within this form. I was once a warrior, one of your own kind, a soldier like you. But they changed me, corrupted me, and turned me into this machine." Darius's chest tightened. A soldier, a human warrior. He was no historian, but his military instincts kicked in. He knew that if this entity was telling the truth, it had to have been a relic from the ancient days, the days of the First Great War, the war that humanity had all but forgotten. It was a war for survival, one that predated even the Seraphis invasion. "The Seraphis," Darius whispered, his eyes narrowing. "They did this to you." The voice let out a bitter laugh, though it was more of a mechanical hiss than true mirth. "The Seraphis did not come to this galaxy in peace. They arrived like predators, seeking to devour, seeking to rule. But I was already here, a remnant of a forgotten age. I fought against them once, but they were stronger. They were relentless. In the end, I was captured, transformed, made into this weapon. Darius took another step forward, his mind reeling. Everything he had thought he understood was shifting. The weapon they sought was no mere tool. It was the soul of a long-dead warrior, forever altered by the very forces they were now fighting against. The implications were staggering. So you were turned into a machine? Darius asked slowly, his voice thick with disbelief. You were a human, and now you're... this? I was a soldier, the voice replied, its tone darkening. I was once flesh and blood, fighting for survival in a galaxy torn apart by war. But now, I am the last of my kind. The price for my power was my humanity, and the price for your victory will be the same. Darius felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the situation was becoming clearer with each passing second. This weapon, this sentient being, was more than they could have ever imagined. To wield its power, they would have to give up everything that made them human. Everything. Behind him, Mira's voice cut through the tension. Commander, we can't just stand here. If we don't act soon, the Seraphis will find us. We don't have time to question this thing. Darius didn't respond immediately. His mind was still reeling from the revelation. The weapon, which they had hoped would be a key to humanity's survival, was bound by its own tragic past. The cost of unlocking its power wasn't just a matter of sacrifice. It was the obliteration of one's very self. What is it you want? From me? Darius finally asked, his voice low and steady, though his thoughts were anything but. I want nothing, the voice replied coldly. I was made for war. I was made to kill. But now I have seen enough. I have been awake for centuries, and I have grown weary of the bloodshed. You ask me to fight again, but at what cost? I cannot offer you victory without claiming your soul in return. Darius's heart pounded in his chest. There it was, the truth that he had been avoiding. To use this weapon, to activate its power, would mean merging with it, becoming one with it, in a way that would erase his humanity, his memories, everything that made him who he was. The weight of the decision was crushing. I can't, Darius muttered, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. I can't sacrifice everything for victory, not like this. We all make sacrifices, the voice intoned, its tone cold. But remember, Commander, victory comes at a price. The question is, are you willing to pay it? The silence in the chamber was deafening, and Darius found himself caught in the gaze of the weapon, the soul that had once been human, now forever entangled in its mechanical prison. His thoughts swirled in confusion, desperation, and fear. What was he supposed to do? How could he lead his people to victory if the price was his own life, his own soul? Mira's hand rested on his shoulder. Commander, we have to make a choice. We can't waste time. Darius looked up at her, his face grim. We'll make our choice. But not yet. The Seraphis fleet was still out there, getting closer. The decision weighed heavy on him, but one thing was certain. The fate of humanity rested on his next move, and that meant facing the truth, no matter how painful it was. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, pressing in on Darius from all sides. The weapon, the sentient warrior, remained still, its crystal core pulsing with an ominous light. The words it had spoken reverberated in his mind, each one a blow to his resolve. I cannot offer you victory without claiming your soul in return. Darius's hand trembled as he clutched the hilt of his blade. The weight of the decision before him felt unbearable. To use the weapon would mean giving up everything. His identity, his humanity, his connection to the crew he led, and possibly his very existence. The thought of it made him sick to his stomach, but the stakes were too high for hesitation. The Seraphis were closing in. Time was running out. If they didn't act, humanity was finished. Mira's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. Commander, we need to move. The Seraphis will be here soon. We can't afford to waste any more time. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. Her face was set, her eyes resolute, but there was an edge of worry in her expression. She didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening, not yet. None of them did. Darius, Mira said softly, I know this isn't easy, but we have to act. The war won't wait for you to find a better solution. Darius looked back at the pedestal, his eyes drawn to the weapon. It wasn't a simple tool. It was a conscious being, a soul trapped within a machine. It was as much a victim as it was a force of destruction, and the cost of unleashing its power was a price no one should have to pay. Yet here they were, on the edge of the abyss, staring down a choice that would define the future of humanity. Commander, we can't turn back now, Ganon said, his voice harsh but steady. The Seraphis are already coming. If we don't take the weapon now, we're all dead anyway. Darius's chest tightened. Ganon's words were true, but that didn't make the decision any easier. He looked at the rest of his team, each one of them waiting for him to make a choice. They were counting on him. Humanity was counting on him. I understand, Darius said finally, his voice low, but we need to know more about the weapon. We need to understand what it's going to do to us before we make a decision. The voice from the crystal flickered, to life again, its tone now softer, almost regretful. You want to understand, Commander. You want to know what I am. Then, listen carefully. Darius stepped closer to the pedestal, his breath catching as the light from the crystal bathed him. In its glow, the air around him crackled with an eerie energy. I was once human, the voice began, born into a world of war. I was trained as a soldier, molded for combat, forged in the fires of battle. But I was not a mere tool. I was a warrior, fighting for my people, fighting for survival. The galaxy was a battlefield, and we were losing. We faced enemies far stronger than we could comprehend, and when all seemed lost, they came to me. The Seraphis, the voice paused, a mechanical hiss filling the silence. Darius could feel the anguish in the tone, a pain that transcended time itself. They promised me victory. They offered me power beyond imagining. But it was a lie. They took everything from me, my flesh, my soul, my very essence. They transformed me into a machine that could only destroy. And in the end, I was no longer human. I was a weapon, a tool for their war. I fought for them, but I was not one of them. I was something else. Darius felt a shiver run down his spine. The weight of the weapon's words sank into him, a heavy burden. This was not just a relic, it was a soul, a person who had been twisted and broken by the very forces they were now fighting. The weapon's past was a mirror of their own struggle, a desperate fight for survival against an enemy that sought to erase them from existence. I was meant to be the last line of defense, the voice continued, but the Seraphis betrayed me. They trapped me here, abandoned me, left me to exist in this form, alone, lost, with only the memories of what I once was. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, his thoughts swirling. The weapon had been a soldier, just like him. The thought struck him deeply. Could he really wield such a power? Could he make the choice to end this war at such a cost? Mira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air. Commander, we don't have time for this. The Seraphis will be here in minutes. Darius turned to her, his face grim. I know, Mira, but we can't just take it without understanding the consequences. This is bigger than us. This is... Commander, Mira began, but the voice of the weapon interrupted. It's too late for hesitation, the voice said, its tone now tinged with urgency. The Seraphis are coming, and once they find you, it will be the end. You want to win this war? Then you must accept the price. Power cannot be wielded without sacrifice. Darius's stomach twisted. The weapon was right. Time was running out. The Seraphis fleet would arrive soon, and if they didn't act, humanity would be wiped out. But the cost of victory, the obliteration of his own humanity, the loss of his soul, was a burden that felt almost too great to bear. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He couldn't just think of his own life. He had a duty to the people he led, to the survivors of humanity who were depending on him. But was this the right way to secure their future? Was it worth the price? Darius took a deep breath. His mind made up. He would do whatever it took to save his people. If the cost was his soul, then so be it. Activate the weapon, Darius ordered, his voice unwavering. Mira hesitated, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but she found none. Commander, are you sure? Darius nodded slowly. We don't have a choice anymore. We've come this far. We'll use the weapon. But I need you to stay with me. We're going to need all of you. Mira gave a single, curt nod, but the uncertainty in her eyes didn't fade. She stepped back and activated the terminal on her wrist, connecting with the weapon's interface. The air around them hummed, the ground vibrating beneath their feet as the pedestal began to shift. A low, rumbling sound filled the chamber, and the crystal began to rise, its energy reaching a fever pitch. I warn you, Commander, the voice of the weapon said one last time, its tone grave. Once you activate me, there is no turning back. You will become a part of me. The merging will be complete. Darius stood tall, his resolve hardening. I understand. The weapon's light intensified, flooding the room with a brilliant glow. Darius felt the energy surge through him, a wave of power that overwhelmed his senses. His vision blurred, his body trembling as if the force of the weapon were trying to tear him apart. And then everything went silent. For a brief moment, there was nothing but a cold, suffocating emptiness. Darius's mind raced, his thoughts fragmented, scattered like shards of broken glass. But then, slowly, they began to coalesce into something different, something more. The world around him seemed to shift and warp, as if the very fabric of reality had bent to the will of the weapon. The light from the pedestal blazed brighter, its intensity blurring Darius's vision. He felt his body tremble, as though the very core of his being was being torn apart and reassembled. The power of the weapon surged through him in a flood of sensations, raw, overwhelming, like a tide that was both too much and not enough. His limbs felt heavy, foreign. He couldn't quite tell where his body ended and the weapon began. It was as if his soul had been stretched and twisted, forced into a new shape, one that did not quite fit. His mind felt fragmented, splintered, pulled in different directions, as memories that weren't his own began to flood his consciousness. He tried to focus, tried to hold on to the person he was. But with each passing second, that person felt more distant, more alien. The warrior's memories, the one who had been here before him, were becoming his own. His thoughts were no longer entirely his own. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating, until he couldn't tell where the weapon ended, and he began. "Commander!" Mira's voice broke through the chaos in his mind, but it sounded far away, distorted. "Darius, talk to me! What's happening?" He opened his eyes. No, his eyes weren't his eyes. The world around him shimmered, distorted by the overwhelming presence of the weapon. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, in the very cells of his being. The alien energy, now part of him. I don't know," Darius said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. It was deeper, distorted by the power coursing through him. He could hear his heart pounding, but it wasn't the sound of his own heart. It was the heartbeat of a machine. Darius staggered back, his knees almost buckling. His mind screamed, "You have to stay human. You can't lose yourself." But his body refused to listen. His senses were overloaded, and his consciousness was slipping away, devoured by the very thing he had sought to control. He clenched his fists. The weapon, this thing that had once been a soldier just like him, was now a part of him. His fingers flexed, and for a moment it felt as though he could feel the pulse of the crystal through his skin. It was alive inside him, coursing through. Every part of him, it was merging with him. No, Darius thought desperately, I can't lose myself, not now, not when humanity needs me. Commander? Mira asked, stepping closer. She sounded alarmed, unsure. Are you all right? You're not responding. Darius's vision blurred. He had to fight it. He had to stay in control. But the longer the weapon's power filled him, the more his thoughts scattered. He saw flashes, images of battles, memories not his own. He saw the soldier who had been here before him, a man with the same resolve, the same pain. He felt the weight of that soldier's grief, the years of being trapped within the weapon, a prisoner of war. He saw a moment, battle. He was there, but it wasn't him. The memories collided. He could see it all now, the war, the slaughter, the promises of victory. The moment when the Seraphis turned him into this thing, this machine, binding him to the very weapon that had once been the hope of humanity. Darius gasped, his hand shooting up to his head as the pain intensified, like 1,000 needles pricking his skull. His body lurched and his breath caught in his throat. I need to fight, Darius muttered, his voice coming out in jagged gasps. The Seraphis, we need to fight. Mira rushed forward, her hand grabbing his arm. Darius, focus! You're not making sense. This is what they warned you about, the cost of activating the weapon. But Darius wasn't listening. He wasn't even sure if he could hear her. The images in his mind, memories that were his and not his, overwhelmed him. He felt the warrior's rage, the warrior's grief, and his own desperation. The weight of the universe crushed down on him. He had made the decision. He had activated the weapon. But now he was losing himself. No, not yet. Not yet. With a staggering effort, Darius forced himself to take control. His fingers tightened around Mira's hand, the strength returning to his grip as he struggled to ground himself in the present. Darius. Mira's voice was trembling, fear creeping into her words. You're changing. I can see it. This isn't you. He looked up at her, his breath ragged. I'm still here, Mira, he whispered hoarsely. I'm still here. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. Before she could respond, the sound of an incoming transmission echoed in his ear. It was Captain Arlen, his second in command. His voice came through loud and clear, sharp with urgency. Commander, we've got a problem, Arlen said. The Seraphis fleet is in range. They're about to engage. We don't have much time. Darius blinked, shaking his head to clear the fog from his mind. He had to focus. The mission was still the same. Humanity's survival was at stake. We're ready, Darius said, his voice low, but with an authority that came from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere beyond himself. Prepare the fleet for battle. It's time to end this. He could feel the power inside him, a weapon that was no longer just a tool, but part of him. It whispered in his mind, urging him to unleash its full potential. The Seraphis were out there, closing in, and they were coming for him. Coming for the weapon. He turned, his movements slow at first, his body still struggling to adapt to the changes. But then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the power of the weapon surged through him. His senses sharpened, and his body hummed with energy. We're going to end this, Darius repeated, more to himself than anyone else. He reached out, his fingers grazing the interface on the pedestal. The crystal pulsed, and a low hum filled the chamber as the ship's systems synced with the weapon. He could feel it now. He wasn't just controlling the ship, the weapon was controlling him. It was no longer a separate entity. He had become the weapon, and it had become him. The lines between them blurred. Darius was no longer just Commander Darius Voss. He was the last soldier. He was the weapon. The ship began to power up, the engines roaring to life as the fleet prepared for battle. Darius's heart thundered in his chest, but it was no longer his heart. It was the heartbeat of the machine. "Commander," Mira said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you still you?" Darius's eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, a flash of the man he once was. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, steely resolve of the weapon. He had made his choice. "I'm still here, Mira," he said, though the words felt distant, as though they were coming from someone else. "I'm still here." The Seraphis fleet loomed on the horizon, and Darius, now fully integrated with the weapon, was ready. The time for hesitation was over. The decisive battle was about to begin. The vastness of space stretched out before Darius, endless and cold. His fleet, once a ragtag assembly of survivors, was now a formidable force. The energy of the weapon surged through him, his senses heightened, every detail of the surrounding. Space as clear as if he were standing within it. The edges of his vision flickered with data streams, star maps, enemy positions, all of it a cold, calculated display. Yet beneath the precision of the machine's power, a part of him, a small, fragile part, was still fighting to stay human. He had been in countless battles before, but this was different. The weapon was with him now, pulsing through his veins, guiding his every move. His mind raced with strategies, combat techniques, and deadly calculations. The Seraphis fleet was closing in, their ships like black holes, devouring all light around. And them, but they were not just enemies, they were the enemy. And for Darius, they represented everything that had caused humanity's fall. "Commander," Mira's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "The Seraphis fleet is within range. The enemy's capital ship is advancing toward us. We're outnumbered 3-1. Darius barely registered her words. He had heard them 1,000 times before in different scenarios. Outgunned, outmanned, yet always fighting, always surviving. But this time the fight felt different. His body didn't belong to him anymore. He was no longer just Darius Voss. He was the weapon, and the weapon was ready to destroy. But at what cost? "Darius," Mira's voice came again, softer this time. "Are you okay? You're not responding." Her words cut through the fog in his mind, and for a fleeting moment, Darius felt the weight of the decision he had made. He had sacrificed everything for this. But was it worth it? Was it worth losing himself, becoming a weapon that was no longer fully human? He blinked, shaking his head to clear his thoughts. "We fight," he said, his voice distant, mechanical. "We end this now." The words sounded like a command, but they felt hollow. His crew needed him, needed the man they once knew, but the weapon within him screamed for victory, for annihilation. He was no longer sure who he was fighting for. The first volley of fire from the Seraphis fleet lit up the darkness of space, a cascade of lasers and explosive projectiles. Darius's flagship, the Sentinel, rocked with the impact, but the weapon's power surged through him, guiding the ship's shields to absorb the blast. His hands moved instinctively, faster than any human could react, calculating angles, anticipating movements. The Seraphis fleet was powerful, but he was more than ready. "Deploy all fighter wings," Darius commanded, his voice still alien to him, but clear and authoritative. His words echoed through the ship's communication system, resonating with the authority of a leader and the cold calculation of a machine. Mira glanced at him, her face pale with worry. "Darius, please, I know what you're thinking. You can't," he turned sharply, locking eyes with her. "This is our only chance. If we don't strike now, humanity is finished." The ship shuddered as enemy fire rained down from above. But Darius's hands were steady on the controls. His fingers danced across the hollow interface, triggering the launch of fighter squadrons. The battle unfolded before him, every movement orchestrated with precision. His mind raced with data, analyzing enemy positions, calculating firing arcs, assessing weaknesses. The fighter wings of his fleet took flight, cutting through the enemy's barrage with surgical precision. But despite his flawless strategy, something was wrong. The Seraphis were not fighting like they usually did. Their fleet was coordinated, too coordinated. There was an underlying strategy that didn't make sense. "Mira," Darius said, his voice colder now, mechanical. "Something's wrong. They're not fighting like a normal invasion force." She turned to him, confusion clouding her eyes. "What do you mean? We've been tracking their movements for weeks. We know their tactics." "No," Darius muttered, his mind piecing together the patterns of the enemy's attacks. "This isn't a normal battle. This is a trap." Before she could respond, a deep, resonating voice filled the command deck, one that wasn't coming from any of their speakers. The voice was cold, calculated, and distinctly not human. "Commander Voss," the voice boomed, "I trust you are enjoying your new power." Darius stiffened. His eyes flicked to the holographic display. The voice was coming from somewhere. From within the Seraphis fleet. "Who's there?" Darius demanded, his heart pounding in his chest. His body burned with the power of the weapon, but the voice of the enemy was still unsettling, as if it had reached into his mind, bypassing all defenses. "You don't recognize me," the voice continued, mocking. "How disappointing. I had hoped you would be more perceptive." Darius felt a chill crawl down his spine as the voice continued. "Let me introduce myself. I am Alien, a high-ranking Seraphis strategist, and I have been watching you, Darius Voss. I've been watching you for a long time." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Darius felt his stomach churn, his pulse quickening. The name Alien was familiar. He'd heard it once before, buried deep in the logs of an old mission briefing. Alien was not just a general. He was a manipulator, one of the minds behind the very conflict that had torn humanity apart. The weapon inside Darius seemed to pulse in response, feeding off the shock and rage that rippled through his mind. He felt its influence, like a voice whispering in his ear, urging him to crush Alien, to end this once and for all. But then another voice, faint but real, pierced through the noise of the machine's thoughts. Mira's voice. "Darius, listen. To me, you don't have to." "Silence," Darius snapped, his voice harsh, more machine than man. "I'm done listening. We've lost enough already." The voice of Alien laughed, a low, eerie sound that sent a shiver down Darius's spine. "You've always been so predictable, Commander. That's why I've let you live this long. I wanted to see how far you'd go, to see if you'd make the same mistake as the others." Darius's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Mistake? What was Alien talking about? The voice continued. "You see, I didn't just want to conquer humanity. I wanted to reshape it, reshape you. You've played into my hands, Darius. The weapon you've embraced, it's not just a tool. It's a prison, a trap. And you, my friend, are its final victim." Suddenly, everything clicked. The weapon had not been just a weapon. It had been designed to trap humanity, to twist its soldiers into instruments of war, just like Alien had twisted it. The Seraphis had always known that humanity's hope for survival would be tied to this weapon, and they had manipulated them all, turning their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. But it was worse than that. Darius realized with a cold horror that the weapon was not just a relic. It had been planted within humanity's reach by the Seraphis, part of a long-term strategy to break their will. "You're the one who's been pulling the strings," Darius muttered, his voice trembling with fury and disbelief. "All this time, you've been controlling us, feeding us lies." Alien's laugh echoed in his mind. And now, Commander, you will be the instrument of your own destruction. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The stars outside the window of the Sentinel appeared distant, unreachable, as though the vastness of space itself were pressing in on Darius, suffocating him. He stood alone in the command center, his hands gripped tightly on the edge of the control panel. The power of the weapon coursed through him, thrumming like a heartbeat, a constant reminder of the sacrifice he had made. But as Alien's voice echoed in his mind, those memories, the memories of a human warrior who had been bound to the weapon for centuries, warped and twisted. Darius felt his mind slipping, the machine's influence pulling at the edges of his consciousness. Commander, Mira's voice cut through the haze, her voice shaking with concern. You're not thinking clearly. You've been manipulated. Darius turned toward her, his eyes cold, almost vacant. I'm thinking clearly, Mira, he said, his voice hollow, robotic. I was born to do this. I was chosen to lead this war. All of it, every loss, every sacrifice, it was all leading to this. No, Darius, no. Her eyes filled with desperation as she stepped closer, her face pleading. This isn't you. The weapon has taken over. It's not too late. You can still fight it. You have to fight it. His gaze flickered, the faintest glimmer of humanity still visible beneath the weight of the machine's presence. I've already made my choice, Mira. The Seraphis have manipulated us for too long. They think they've won, but they haven't. The thought of the Seraphis, of Alien's mocking voice, sent a surge of rage through Darius. His grip tightened. On the control panel, the metal groaning beneath his fingers as the power inside him thrummed with force. The Seraphis were more than an enemy. They were the architects of this war, the ones who had twisted everything, his mission, his people, even his very existence, into something unrecognizable. And yet, at that moment, Darius realized something deeper, something that cut deeper than any weapon could. He had allowed himself to be consumed by the very thing that he had sought to control. He had become part of the system, the endless cycle of violence, and in doing so, he had nearly destroyed everything he had fought to protect. Alien's voice broke through the silence once again, its mocking tone sharper than ever. You can't. Fight it, Darius. You've become mine. You'll destroy everything in your wake. Humanity's last hope is nothing more than a puppet. Your actions are already decided. The weight of the words pressed on Darius, and for a moment he wondered if it was true. Had he truly become a puppet, no different from the soldiers he had sent to die? Had the weapon destroyed everything he once stood for? Mira's voice, soft but unwavering, broke through his spiraling thoughts. You're still you, Darius. I know you are. The weapon doesn't own you unless you let it. He closed his eyes, the images of battle, of bloodshed, flashing in his mind. He saw the faces of the fallen, the soldiers who had followed him, believed in him. They had fought for humanity's survival just as he had. But in the end, they had died because of choices like his, because of a war that had spiraled out of control. Darius clenched his fists. He had always believed that his strength, his resolve, would be enough to save humanity. But now he saw that it was not enough, not when the cost was so high. How can I undo it, Mira? He whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in what felt like years. How do I stop this? Mira didn't answer right away. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out, almost as if she were afraid to touch him. But she did, placing her palm gently on his arm. You have to choose, Darius. You have to choose who you want to be. It was the first time someone had reminded him of his humanity. And in that moment, as he felt the weapon's presence stirring within him, something shifted. The Seraphis fleet loomed ahead, their ships poised for the final strike. But Darius felt a sudden clarity, a spark of light in the darkness. The weapon, for all its power, was not invincible. It was a tool, a weapon of destruction, and it had consumed him because he had let it, but he wasn't lost. He didn't have to be. "I won't be a puppet, alien," Darius said, his voice stronger now, tinged with defiance. "I won't let you win." The weapon within him hummed, almost as if it were growling in protest, but Darius fought back against the rush of power, forcing himself to regain control. Alien's voice came again, sharp and dangerous. "You cannot win, Darius. You are nothing without me. You have no power of your own." Darius shook his head. "I've always had power. I've always had a choice." He reached for the console, fingers trembling, and activated the emergency override. The Sentinel shuddered as its systems recalibrated, the weapon's control weakening. The weapon's power began to diminish, but it fought back, forcing his mind to scramble, to push harder against it. He could feel the struggle. It was like a fight within his very soul, a battle between the man he had once been and the cold machine he had become. And then, in that final, decisive moment, Darius made his choice. He severed the connection, not just to the weapon, but to the war itself. His mind cleared, his body felt lighter as the machine's grip loosened. The pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had been lifted from his chest. The Seraphis fleet was closing in fast, but Darius had no intention of surrendering, not anymore. He turned to Mira, his eyes now filled with resolve, not rage. "We'll fight them together," he said, "but we do it on our terms." And so, as the first wave of Seraphis fire streaked toward them, Darius led his fleet, not as a weapon, but as a man. A man who had made the ultimate sacrifice, not by giving up his life, but by reclaiming his soul. The last battle of humanity had begun, but this time, it would not be fought with destruction alone. It would be fought with hope.